Hello again, and welcome to the second part of our lecture on human capital. So now we're going to talk about a signaling model. So in the previous lecture, we talked about how investment in human capital leads to increase in productivity, and that would increase your wages. And if you remember, in terms of stylized facts, we know that there's a strong positive correlation between education and wages. Well, the signaling model is an alternative explanation for this relationship. And it says that we could have this relationship even if education doesn't provide any productivity enhancing aspects. Okay, so we tend to think of education as, increasing productivity because of this causality or relationship of education and wages. So we usually think of there's a causality between education and wages. But with this alternative theory, we can see that there could be a relationship between education and wages that has nothing to do with productivity, because basically we can think of education as a signal of ability rather than it actually creating the ability itself. Okay, so this relationship between education and wages could be due to ability rather than any productivity enhancing attributions of education. So the signaling model is so there's certain indicators, okay, age, experience, education, and personal characteristics that are correlated to productivity, right? Um, However, employers cannot really determine the actual productivity of any applicant during the interviewing process. And so, therefore, they rely on formal education that workers acquire. So, we're saying that the educational system is sort of uh, a sorting mechanism. It's a way of finding out who is productive. And employers can use education as a signaling device, which enables them to sort workers into different levels or categories of productivity rather than assume all workers or applicants are average. So the relationship between higher education and higher wages is not because of the education itself, but through education being a filter of ability. So we can observe a positive relationship between wages and education, even if the latter does not enhance productivity. And we'll see why. Okay, so we're going to say that education reveals a level of attainment which signals a worker's qualification or innate ability to potential employers. And we're going to say that information that is used to allocate workers in the labor market is called a signal. And we could have what's called a separating equilibrium, where low productivity workers choose not to obtain X years of education, voluntarily signaling their low productivity. High productivity workers choose to get at least X years of schooling and separate themselves from the pack. Okay, so let's look at a diagram to get a better feel for this. So here we have our wage. We have years of education beyond high school. So let's suppose employers use education to classify workers, and any with less than E star years of education are considered lower ability by the employers, and anyone who gets at least E star uh, would be of high ability. Okay, so any workers that don't have E star years of education won't be uh, hired. They won't be getting a wage of one. Sorry, they will be prevented from any job paying a wage above one. Okay, so we have two wages, one and two. We have our E star. Any workers who don't have E star, so if they have anything less than E star, employers are going to believe that they're low ability and will only offer them a wage of one. Any workers who have education above E star would be offered a wage of 2. Okay? Now, let's think about, so in order for this to work, low-abled workers should not want to get E star years of schooling. Because if they do, then the firms will be hiring them thinking they're high ability and getting the wage. So if education is a signaling device which yields a wage of 2, all workers would want to acquire the signal of E star if it were costless for them to do so, right? So if it was costless, so if the cost, and remember, we're not only talking about monetary cost, we're talking about psychic cost. So if there wasn't any difference in the cost for low and high ability, then they would all just get the required years of schooling, and they would end up getting paid the higher wages, and the workers and the employers would end up not being able to sort out who's high and low ability. And so in that case, if the costs were the same, there would be, there's no signal here. So there's no separating equilibrium. But let's suppose that the costs of education are lower for those with high ability compared to those with low ability. And here we're thinking more of psychic costs. So we can think of the disutility to school. So people with low ability, generally, maybe we can also think of motivation. So low ability motivation, they find that getting education is much more costlier in terms of psychic costs than people who are of high ability. So let's suppose the costs for low ability are represented by this red line. So as we increase years of schooling, our costs increase. And for high ability, they're lower at every level of education. And this is their line. Okay, so now let's think about the optimal choice of education for each type of worker. Consider a low ability worker. If they choose to get E star, they'll get a wage of 2, but their costs are going to be here. And the difference between 2 and whatever this value is here is less than 1. And so they would be better off just getting 0 years of schooling and getting a wage of 1. 1 is higher than the difference between this distance here. So there is no incentive here for low ability workers to get education E star. Okay, now for signaling to work, high abled people must find it advantageous to get E star at least years of schooling. And so let's look at the high ability. Well, if someone with high ability chooses to get 0 years of schooling, they'll get a wage of 1, so the return would be 1. But if they choose to get E star years of schooling, they're going to get 2, and 2 minus the value associated here, this cost, is larger than 1. And so their benefit is this entire vertical line here, which is greater than 1, and so they would choose to get E star. So in this case, education is just working as a signal, and we have a separating equilibrium. Here's another example. So here we have the present value of lifetime earnings for a particular person. This is a certain level. This is the present value of earnings, which is higher, at a higher level. We have the cost of education for less productive workers or low ability workers. And we have that the costs are half as much for high abled workers. Okay, here's our E star again. And so do we have a separating equilibrium here? Well, if education is a signal, then workers who are high ability, or any worker who gets E star, is going to get the wage of PVE2. But we have to make sure that the right workers are going to get that. So if we think about low ability workers, If they try to masquerade as high ability and get E star years of schooling, they're going to get a return of B, but their cost is D. Okay? So they're going to get a benefit of this distance between B and D. But similar to before, if they get 0 years of schooling, their costs are zero, and they can get a pay of A, a present value of earnings of A. And so this distance here is greater than the distance between B and D. So here there's no incentive for low ability workers or less productive workers to masquerade as high ability. Okay? What about high ability? Well, if they were to get 0 years of schooling, they would get this distance here. But if they actually get E star, they're going to get B of present value of lifetime earnings, and the cost is all the way down here at F. So this distance here is greater than this distance here. And so again, yes, we do have separating equilibrium. So again, if you consider low ability workers, suppose they choose E1 years of schooling. Well, their return is not going to be very good. They're going to get this. The actual return will be this distance here. So they can maximize their return by getting 0 years of schooling. For high ability workers, suppose they choose E2. They're going to get return or their present value of lifetime earnings is going to be PVE2, and the cost will be down here. Okay, let's consider the low productivity workers again. Suppose they select E1 years of schooling. Then the benefit for schooling to them would be the distance of this red line. This is their benefit, this is their cost. And we can see they would never choose anything like E2. They would only choose E0 here because that's where they could maximize this benefit. So for the low abled workers are never going to, if they're going to choose something below E star, it's always going to be 0. Now let's suppose they choose an education level like E2. They're going to get this as their net present value. This is going to be their cost. This is going to be less than this. So if they were going to pick there's no incentive for them to pick anything above E star. Okay? And they wouldn't pick E star because we already know that this distance here is less than this distance here, which is what the difference, their net benefit would be if they just got 0 years of schooling. Okay, so the max education level for low productivity workers is going to be 0, and for high ability workers, it's going to be E star. Okay, so here is a diagram again. We have our cost lines. We have different levels of education, different wages. And so here we have the wage structure. So we're going to say that employers are going to offer a wage of 2 if people get above a certain schooling level, but only 1 if it's below that. Low ability workers' cost of acquiring education is given by this line, and so their return to acquiring S star is given by 2 minus CLS star. Okay, so 2 minus whatever this is at S star. Okay, so they're better off not going to school and accepting the lower wage. Okay, so I'm just going over this again so it's very clear, so we have different examples for you to study from. Okay, and here for high ability workers, we get that they're better off acquiring education levels S star because the 2 minus the much lower costs at this level, which is here, is better for them. Okay, so this is just another example for your notes. Okay, now requiring a greater signal may have costs without any benefits. So it's just one of the negative aspects of a signaling model is that it's possible that uh, how do you select this optimal number of schooling? Suppose that it's E prime here. Okay, we know E star will work, right? Will work as an effective signal. But what's stopping the employer from saying, well, why not have higher educated workers? What if they increase it to E prime? Well, if they increase it to E prime, you're still going to have the same outcome. High ability are going to get this benefit here, all this distance here. So from B prime to F prime, if they go and get E prime, okay? And so they're going to have, this is going to be a bigger benefit than if they choose not to get any school and take the distance A0. So there's still, so this still works as a signal. Um, we know that low ability workers, if they choose E prime, they're going to get this amount of a benefit from getting the education, but they're better off just getting no schooling and getting this much larger distance here. So what basically you have going on here is if the employers could increase the amount of required education, all of these resources in society will go towards that, because typically education, well, even if it's not covered by the government, it's still, we have scarce resources and they're going to be put towards something that may not be doing anything productive. There might not be any additional benefits. And so, it's just a caution about signaling. So even if it works, it can work as a signal, but it may not be something, you know, it may be difficult to find an optimum for this type of model. So what are the implications of this model? So for schooling to act as a signal, and so if you haven't noticed already, in order for this to work, schooling must be more costly for the low ability workers compared to high ability workers, or simply this won't work. Okay, so one of the implications is that this must be true for signaling to work. And also the social return to schooling, so the percentage increase in national income, is likely to be positive even if a worker's human capital is not increased. So again, that's just the result of signaling. If education is just acting as a sorting mechanism to sort between low and high ability workers, then you're going to have higher earnings for those with an education compared to those without. And so hence you have this positive relationship between education and earnings, but there's no it's not due to an increase in human capital, an increase in the skills acquired through education. Okay, so in reality, there is likely a bit of both. I'm sure there is some sort of a signaling effect, but certainly that's not all of the reason. There are many skills that you do acquire and through getting an education, which are certainly applicable, in my opinion, in the labor market. Okay, so let's just look at some empirical evidence. So here are some education and earnings profiles. This is similar to what we saw before. We see this fanning out effect, okay? And we know that for higher educated workers, they tend to increase steeply when they're young, but they don't flatten out till later. And lower educated workers tend to have lower profiles. Okay, so this is just a recap on the aspects or characteristics of age earnings profiles that we saw before. And these are some for the US. You see a similar sort of pattern. So again, the important properties are highly educated workers earn more than low educated workers. Earnings rise over time at a decreasing rate. We tend to see this fanning outward of the profiles. and earnings increase faster for more educated workers. Now let's talk about the human capital earnings function. So this is something we use to get an estimate of the rate of return to education. So how much does a year of schooling increase your wages in terms of a percent? We need to obviously control for other factors that may affect earnings, right? And uh, so we want to control for things like ability and experience. So what we do to estimate the returns of schooling is we run what's called a wage regression. On the left here, the dependent variable is lawn wages. Okay, this is, since there's no logarithms on the right hand side, this is called a semi-log specification. So when we have this, we can interpret the coefficients on these variables as percentages. So if r were to equal 0.10, then we can say that 1 year of schooling increases the wages by 10%. Okay, so we're trying to estimate this coefficient, which is the return to schooling, and then we're going to control for other things. We'd obviously want to control for years experience. We'd also want to control for a lot of other things. The main part of the specification contains experience and experience squared, because we think it has a nonlinear relationship. You know, as workers gain more work experience, their earnings increase, but usually at a decreasing rate. Okay, and E here is just the random error in the model, which represents things like motivation, luck, and that sort of thing. So if we look at some estimates of this equation, we get, different, it depends on which population you're working at. So here's just an example of log earnings by years of schooling for women aged 35 to 39. Okay, we see there's a positive relationship. And here, so here we have an example of where we estimate this model on women aged 35 to 39. In this example, we have just here we have just years of schooling. Okay, so if we run a regression of ln y on years of schooling, we get this. Okay, so we see a positive relationship. We would also want to include in here years of experience and other variables that could affect wage. Now, bringing up this estimation brings about another concept that we need to be aware of. So we saw that ability could possibly influence our years of schooling, right? Because we were saying, people who have high ability may have lower costs to getting, psychic costs of getting an education. So when you're estimating the returns to schooling, you want to control for ability, or else the returns to schooling you're getting could be biased upwards, because they're picking up the effect of ability and not the actual productivity enhancing aspects of education. Okay, so if there's systematic differences between low and high educated people that affect earnings and schooling, then the estimate is biased. Okay, so it's very difficult to get an accurate estimate because you want to control for things like ability and motivation, perseverance, tolerance, things that could be very important other than education and experience in determining your wage. You want to be able to control for these, but if you think of data sets that you would collect on people, it's very difficult to measure these things. How do you think of having a survey and asking the person to provide their ability level? Like it's a very difficult thing to measure. Okay, so again, if education acts really like a screening device, and you don't control for these things, then you're going to get a very biased estimate. Here's an example. In theory, we have on the left here the internal rate of return diagram. And so for these two people, they're going to determine a level of schooling that is different. So for Ace would want to get 11 years of schooling, and Bob would want to get 12 years of schooling. Okay, so they both have the same discount rate, but each worker is going to face a different wage schooling locus or age earnings profile. So Bob, who gets more schooling, is going to have a higher profile than Ace, who gets less schooling. Okay? So here we have Ace dropping out of high school and Bob getting a high school diploma in our example. So if we look at, say, the data, we would see that Bob has a higher wage than Ace. And we may say, well, okay, that's due to Bob getting an extra year of school. But the wage differential between Bob and Ace arises both because Bob goes to school for one more year and because Bob is more able. As a result, the wage differential 11 versus 12 does not tell us by how much Ace's earnings would increase if he were to complete high school. So you can't say that if Ace decided to get that extra year of schooling, we can't say that his earnings are going to be the same as Bob's. So that difference, we can't just take this difference here, so between Ace, the wage of Ace, and if we, so if we were to say that Ace would make WHS if Ace were to get an extra year of schooling, we would be wrong, okay? And as I said, the difference between the wages of Bob and Ace are due to the difference in years of schooling, okay, but also due to differences in ability. So there's a trouble here disentangling the two. Okay, so the wage differential does not tell us by how much Ace's earnings would increase if he were to complete high school. Okay, we don't know what this point would actually be. So if we just had data from here, so if you think about what the data we would have would be, it would be we have a wage for Ace who has dropped out of school and has 11 years of schooling. We have another wage for another person who went to high school. And so the difference in their wage is this amount here. Can we, the main question is, can we say that if Ace were to go to finish high school, he would get this same wage? Well, the answer is no. We can't say it's the return to schooling is estimated by this line because Ace could have lower ability or motivation or any of those other unobserved factors. And so it's possible that if Ace finished high school, his wage would be much lower than Bob's. Okay? So there's different ways to address ability bias. The sort of gold standard, which we can think of as a benchmark, would be to take a large number of people and randomly put them into two different groups. One that, for example, finishes high school and another that doesn't. And so you'd have a huge, you'd have to have a very large sample of people. And since you're randomly assigning people to getting high school and to not getting high school, there shouldn't be any differences between the two groups, right? If you put, say, 10,000 people and randomize them into two different groups of 5,000, and you say you use some kind of a random number generator to assign them to each of the two groups, there shouldn't be any differences in the ability of the two groups. There shouldn't be any differences in motivation or any of those unobservable factors. There shouldn't be any differences in observable factors either. But the problem, and so if we were to do that, then we could take the difference in the returns to their schooling and be assured that the difference is a result of the treatment, being that they finished high school versus not finished high school. So, but we can't do that in the real world, obviously. So, randomized controlled trials aren't possible in this type of situation. It is for things like testing the effectiveness of medicine, but that's not possible here. So, what the only thing we can really do is different natural experiments. So, we could try to mimic a randomized controlled trial that we could basically find a mechanism that affects or assigns the education levels of groups of individuals in some way independent of the individual's expected returns to schooling. And that way we could isolate the influence of education from unobserved ability factors. Some studies have looked at twins, so you'll have some variation in the schooling level of twins, but since they're the same DNA, same genetics, you can assume maybe that they would have the same innate ability, and so we can use them to look at the difference. So some studies have done that. Another study looked at compulsory school attendance laws. So here you have a law stating that students have to remain in school until their 16th or 17th birthday. Okay, and and so since children who are born in different months would start school at different ages, you have variation in years of schooling that has nothing to do with ability. It has to do with this law. And so then you can, use that idea and compare and see what the returns to that additional amount of schooling that was obtained, and that had nothing to do with the person's ability. Another study looked at how far people are from their proximity to college campuses. People who are closer to a college campus may be more likely to get, a college education, and your proximity to a college likely isn't correlated at all with ability or motivation or anything like that. So in this study done by Card in 1995 found that the return was roughly 7.5% for 1 year of schooling. So there's a range of estimates that have been found in the literature. They range between 8 and 11%. Okay, so let's finish up by talking about training. So this is on-the-job training that we're talking about. So general training is training that is, of course, general, meaning it can be used across different firms. So, reading or writing is a general skill, but there could be other general skills that could be applicable to many firms. For example, if you think of someone who's learned how to use different woodworking materials, right, or skills associated with carpentry. Well, those are pretty general skills that any firm that is producing some type of woodworking object is going to need those skills. Okay, so firms would offer higher wages for this type of training, and we'll see why that's the case. And then the trainee would be willing to bear the cost. So in a simple setting, we'll see why it would make sense that firms would be willing to offer higher wages for someone who has this training, and then the trainees would be willing to bear the cost of this training since the higher wages would be offered for the skill. Alternatively, specific training, that of course is various skills that are only useful at a particular firm. So say you're working at a firm and they use a certain type of software that they developed to maybe a database software to record to keep records on their company or something like that. Well, that skill isn't useful in other firms because that particular piece of software was developed by the firm for itself, not for other firms. But if you think of something like Microsoft Access, well, many different firms use that. So if you have skills in Microsoft Access, you would consider those as general skills, not specific skills. And so we'll see in the case of specific training, um, a trainee would not really be, in a competitive labor market, would be unwilling to bear the cost if there's no higher earnings. So we'll see that also the firm does not have to pay higher wages because other firms are not competing for such trainees. Let's look at this in a diagram so that it makes more sense. So here we have uh, our wages. So we have a wage A, which is equal to the value of the marginal product. So we're assuming a competitive market here. Okay. Now we're talking about general skills. Okay, so this wage would be the cost to the employer and the benefit for the worker. Okay, let's assume that this wage is the wage in the absence of any training. So this person can get this wage on the market without any training. Now, the firm, let's say the firm pays a lower wage than this amount for a certain period over which the training is acquired, and that after the training, the worker is paid a wage above what they would get before, their competitive wage. So now the question is, would this worker agree to, forego a lower wage in order to get this higher wage later? And would the firm pay this higher wage later? Well, the answer here is yes. If the benefits exceed the cost, then it would be worthwhile to make this investment. So, so let's, and who would make the investment? So here, the worker would be interested in making the investment because the firm has no incentive. The firm could pay the worker, the firm could pay for the training, and so over this period would pay them their regular wage. The worker could get the training, but then, and then they're going to be worth this amount. This is their value of marginal product. It would be worth more. They could get this training elsewhere. They could get a job elsewhere getting this wage. So there's no benefit or no incentive for the worker to stay at that particular firm. So the firm would not have any incentive to pay for that training. So there is an incentive for the worker because the benefits would exceed the cost. And so in this case, the worker would be happy to take a lower wage while they're getting the training, and then they could get a higher wage afterwards. What about specific skills? So again, suppose this is the wage a person can get in the market without the training. Okay. During the training, this is the value of the worker. And this is the value of the worker after the training, but only at that specific firm. Okay, so now, would the worker be willing to forego earnings to get this training or no? Well, it's, first of all, the benefits would have to exceed the costs. And who would make the investment? So here the firm would provide the training and pay WA. So in this case, it would make sense for the firm to just pay their regular wage, the value of their marginal product without the training. So the worker isn't going to lose any money for the training, right? They're going to get paid this amount, even though their value is going to be much lower during the training period. And if they stay at the firm, they're going to get, if they were to stay at the firm, the benefits would be this amount here. But the worker is just going to get paid WA, and the firm would keep the benefits. Okay? Um, if the worker leaves, then they're still only going to get this wage. So there's not really much of an incentive for them to leave. So this would make the most optimal sense, and this is what you would see happen given the assumptions of a competitive market, etc. Now, there is a bit of a incentive for this specific training to be a shared investment. Okay, and that's because of the uncertainty associated with the worker quitting, because the firm will pay them their regular wage. They'll have to uh, forego some productivity from that worker, but it is possible that the worker could quit. There isn't much of an incentive to quit because they're getting paid the same as another firm. But if there is still that uncertainty, and so it would actually make a bit of sense to share the benefits. So perhaps the worker could get paid a little bit less than WA during the training period, and the employer could pay a little bit more than WA after the training period. Okay, and then there's some mutually, so both of the parties have invested in this training, and so there's a greater likelihood that they will have a longer relationship and be able to reap the benefits of this training. Because now this worker would get a higher wage, and they would be less likely to leave because the wage is higher than WA. And remember, this is specific training, so the worker can only get WA outside of the firm. Now they're getting W star, so that's a good thing, and they'd want to stay there compared to leaving. And they've also put a little bit of their own investment into this training, so that's another reason they would want to stay. And so, in this in this sense, it would make in this case it would make sense for specific training to be shared. And so if we look at earnings growth with gradual training, we would have, instead of the discrete jumps like we had in the last diagram, we have a smooth curve, and we would have something that looks like this. Overall, the conclusions would be the same. Okay, now let's think about the government, how the government comes into play here. So uh, private markets may not provide the socially optimum amounts of training because there's imperfect information, there's regulatory restrictions, training subsidies to the disadvantaged could increase working hours, raise wages above the poverty line. And so we, there is a role for government in training. Uh, Private markets would certainly not always produce the socially optimum amount. If you remember from your microeconomics class, the optimum in a market is, if you think of the demand and supply curve, and the demand curve as being the marginal benefit and the supply curve being the marginal cost, unless the externalities are incorporated into those curves, the socially optimum amount typically won't be produced. And so that could be because of externality. And if you think of education, there is positive externalities with education. So the socially optimum amount may not be what's produced, because when individuals decide to get education, they're only interested in their benefits, the internal benefits, not any external benefits. So usually it would be under the amount of education would be less than the socially optimum amount. Um, and then there's other reasons listed here: imperfect information, regulatory restrictions, that sort of thing. Um, so, and again, that regulatory restrictions is sort of getting to the idea that you know, private companies can't issue degrees. Only government institutions or institutions regulated heavily by the government can issue degrees. So um, that's what they're getting at there. Um, But there are lots of other avenues too where training would be useful. So, people who are very poor, who can't afford to get education, can't afford to pay for it. Well, there's a role for the government to provide free education, which could help increase their wages and their overall um, pay, and just their contribution to society overall. So there is an appropriate role for government to provide training, and they do this. I know in Canada, and I would imagine the United States as well. People who lose their job and who are on unemployment insurance do have some opportunities to get subsidized training from the government in order to help them find a new job that they're trained for. This is important when we think of structural unemployment. Okay, so let's do some questions. So let's suppose the cost of obtaining a university degree for high productivity and low productivity type workers are as follows. High productivity is CH equals 20,000 Y. CL is equal to 40,000 Y, and Y is years in university. Okay, so if we want the cost, we take the years that they're going to be in university and multiply it by the respective numbers here, and then we'll get the cost. In an economy, workers with a university degree are paid a lifetime income of $600,000, and workers without a university degree are paid a lifetime income of $450,000. For low productivity workers, the net benefit of 4 years of university is, what's the answer? Well, the net benefit of not going to university is, okay, so I'll let you, maybe you should pause and we can take a look at that. Okay, let's do some practice questions. So here we have two individuals, high productivity and low productivity. We have their costs. Their costs are as follows: 20,000 times Y, 40,000 times Y. Y is years in university. And here we have that workers with a university degree have a lifetime income of 600,000, and workers without a university degree have a lifetime income of 450,000. So for low productivity workers, what would the net benefit of 4 years of university be? And what would the net benefit of not going to university be? Okay, and then for high productivity, same thing. Okay, so let's think about this. So you should pause it and think about what the answers will be, and we will discuss them in a second. Okay? Okay, so for a low ability person, if they get a university degree, they're going to get 600,000, but the cost to them will be 40,000 times 4. Okay, and so the net benefit would be 440. If they get no university, then they're going to get 450,000, and this is going to be zero because there's no cost. And so that would be 450,000. So in that case, low ability will not choose to go to university. They'll choose to get, oh, my mistake. Okay, so low ability. If they decide to go to university, their net benefit will be 440,000. It'll be the 600,000 minus the cost of going to university, which is 4 times 40,000. If they don't go to university, they're going to get 450,000. Okay? And that's 450,000 minus 0, because there's no cost for them here because they're not getting any education beyond high school. So what would they do? They would decide on no university, right? So they would get no university. Now, what would a high ability person do? Well, if they go to university, they're going to get $520,000. If they don't go to university, they're going to get that $450,000 also. But clearly, because the costs are much lower for high ability to go to school, the net benefit of them going to university, getting that higher income outweighs the cost, and they would decide to go to university. And so we would have a separating equilibrium here. Now, what if the costs changed? What if the costs were 25,000 Y and 41,000 Y? Okay, and then we still have a lifetime income of 600,000 for university and 430,000 for non-university. If they don't go to university, that would be their earnings. Would this result in an effective screening device? Why or why not? And then what would be the pay range for university graduates that would result in a separating equilibrium? So pause it for a moment, see if you can figure out the answer, and then I'll let you know in a moment. Okay, so in this case, when we do the calculations, going to university for the low ability person would yield 446,000, but if they don't, it would yield 430,000. So already we know that we would have low ability deciding it to go to university. High ability would also decide to go to university. There's no separating equilibrium, so education here is not working as an appropriate sorting device. Okay. In order for it to act as a proper sorting device, we can figure out what the range of incomes, or the pay would have to be for each one. So I'll go back. So I'm going to answer this question: what is the pay range for university graduates that would result in a separating equilibrium? So what we need is for low ability to choose no university. So we need this. So the pay, X minus 41,000 times Y minus 610,000 minus 41,000 Y to be, we need this to be greater than that. And for high ability, we need this to be greater than that. Okay, and so when we work that out, well, we could look at it in a simpler way. We could say, basically, we need this to be less than 430,000, because that's the amount with no university, where you can just ignore this term. So we need X minus 41,000 times 4 has to be less than 430,000. Okay, so that has to be true for low ability workers to decide to choose no university. Okay, and if we work this out, we get that X has to be less than 594,000. Okay, so if X is less than 594,000, then low ability workers will choose no income. Okay, and let me just go back here for a sec and let you see the answer to the second part there. The fonts were a little too large. So for the second part, we want that high ability workers choose to go to university. So we want X minus 25,000 times 4 to be greater than 430,000. Okay, and when we work that out, we get that X has to be greater than 530,000 for high ability to choose university. Okay, so given the cost that we have, the payments for going to university and not going to, the payment for going to university must be between 530,000 and 594,000. If that is between these two numbers, the pay to go to university, if it's between those two numbers, then you will get a separating equilibrium. Okay, let's do some multiple choice questions. According to the signaling theory of education, the level of education or training directly measures the productivity of the worker. Is that the correct answer. Is B the correct answer? The level of education or training of one worker affects the productivity of other coworkers. And C, education and training function as utility generating goods from the worker's perspective. D, education and training do not contribute directly to productivity, but as a filter to screen candidates. And E, the social rate of return to education is greater than the private rate of return. So which one do you think is the correct answer? So according to signaling theory, we know that the main characteristic of that theory is that education is only a signal. It doesn't provide any productivity enhancing aspects, and so it's just used as a filter to screen candidates. Next question. The essence of human capital theory is it firms spend money on their capital stock and equipment in order for labor to become more productive. Investments are made in human resources so as to improve their productivity and therefore their earnings. All workers want to increase their salary, should obtain a university diploma. Workers invest in it in order to send a signal to potential players. So what's the answer here? We should know it by now. Well, human capital theory is sort of the opposite of the signaling theory. Human capital theory is that firms spend money on their capital stock. Investments are made in human resources so as to improve their productivity and their earnings. Next question. In the context of discounted present value, under what conditions can the sum of the income earned in each period divided by the discounting factor be replaced by the payment divided by the interest rate? So remember, it was y divided by r. Okay, I'll let you think about that for a moment. Okay, it was A. It was when the stream of payments is collected over a long period of time. Now, in this question, we're asked what the regression estimation specification was that is used to estimate the returns to schooling. So which one of these specifications is the one we talked about in the lecture? You can pause it and then I'll give you the answer. So the answer is A. Okay, so we have R times years of schooling, and then we have these coefficients in front of experience and experience squared. So we have a quadratic in experience. Which of the following regarding education as signaling is correct? I'll let you think about that. You may want to pause it and then I'll give you the answer. Okay, which one is correct regarding signaling? It is C. Okay, again, the role of education in this model is only a filter to screen workers. Okay, it has no effect on productivity. Now, which of the following incorrectly addresses the problem of ability bias? So remember, ability bias is the fact that the estimates to the returns to schooling could be overstated because of ability not being controlled for. So I'll give you a second to think about the answer. So you may want to pause the video. Okay, so the answer is C. This is the one that's incorrect. Okay, they don't understate, they overstate the true causal effect. Well, thank you again. And in the next lecture, we'll be learning about the wage structure in an economy. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time.